The world stopped. It didn't just slow down. It fractured into a million ice-cold, crystalline moments, each one a perfect, silent photograph of the instant my wife was struck. One moment, she was standing in the late afternoon sun, the golden light catching the defiant strands of hair that had escaped her ponytail, her voice a low, steady bulwark against the encroaching tide of ugliness. The next, she was on the ground. A single, brutal motion had erased her from the vertical world, leaving a void in the air where she had just been. A gasp, stolen from her lungs before it could form a sound. A bright, almost surreal crimson bloom spreads from her lip against the pale, shocked canvas of her skin. And I was standing on the porch, 15 feet away, a cheap green garden hose still clutched in my hand, the water cascading silently onto the grass, pooling around my worn leather boots in a dark, spreading stain of my own inaction. I hadn't moved. I hadn't blinked. For a critical, unforgivable series of heartbeats that stretched into an eternity, I just watched it happen. Across the lawn, parked on the pristine asphalt of our quiet cul-de-sac, sat a gleaming black Lincoln Navigator. It was the kind of vehicle that didn't just drive. It made a statement of quiet, expensive domination. Beside it, Mr. Thorne stood as a monument to suburban superiority. He didn't flinch. He didn't show a flicker of concern or surprise. He was a man in his late 50s, his face a smooth, unlined mask of expensive dermatologists and a deep, profound moral bankruptcy. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, a helmet of engineered respectability. He was a former commercial property developer who carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a man who believed the entire world was his personal boardroom, and everyone in it was either an asset or an obstacle. As Sarah's crumpled form lay on the gravel path she had so meticulously laid, Thorne calmly, deliberately adjusted the platinum cufflink on his French-cuffed shirt. His gaze flicked, not to my wife, but to the thug who had thrown the punch. "Was that necessary, Carl?" he asked, and his voice was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. It wasn't angry. It wasn't shocked. It was bored. It was the clinical, detached tone of a CEO, questioning a minor budget overrun, a sound utterly devoid of humanity. The enforcer, Carl, was a thick-necked slab of muscle poured into a tactical polo that was 2 sizes too small and a lifetime too arrogant. He was the physical manifestation of Thorne's will, a blunt instrument for a man who considered his own hands too clean for dirty work. He rubbed his knuckles, the knuckles that had just connected with my wife's face, as if he were polishing a trophy. "She was non-compliant," he stated, the words dull and heavy, a justification that required no further thought. It was the simple, brutal logic of a hammer that believes every problem is a nail. It was the grunt of a man, whose only tool was violence. My mind, however, wasn't simple. It wasn't brutal. In that frozen eternity, as the world held its breath, my mind became a storm of ice-cold, silent calculation. This wasn't a shock. This wasn't fear. This was a process, a ghost from a former life, a man I had spent years and thousands of miles trying to bury in the quiet soil of this peaceful life, had just taken the controls. The suburban husband, the quiet neighbor, the man holding the garden hose. He was gone. In his place was the operator. "Threat assessment initiated," the voice in my head stated, its tone as clear and calm as a pre-mission briefing. Timestamp, 1642. Environment, open air, residential. Hostels, 2, designated Hostel 1 and Hostel 2. Principal, 1, designated Thorne. Asset, 1, Sarah, status compromised, on the ground. My status, engaged. Hostel 1, Carl. Estimated weight, 240, maybe 250. Height, 6'1". Clear aggressor, right dominant, telegraphs his movements. Low-level training at best, likely bar fighting experience. Current posture, relaxed, post-adrenal confidence, a vulnerability. Hostile 2 younger, leaner, hangs back by the vehicle. Posture, nervous energy, shifting weight from foot to foot. Acts as a lookout, but its focus is divided. Inexperienced, a non-factor until Carl is neutralized. Principal Thorne, non-combatant, high-value target. Current posture, arrogant, detached, the brain of the operation, the true enemy. Weapon check, none visible on hostiles but assume concealed carry. Thorne is clean. My assets, 0. Distance to hostile 1, 15 feet. Unacceptable. Optimal response time to neutralize, 2.7 seconds. Drop the hose, bridge the gap in 3 strides. First contact, deflect the inevitable clumsy swing, control the weapon hand. Second contact, elbow strike to the temporal fossa, initiating neurological shutdown. Third contact, follow with a knee strike to the floating rib, ensuring incapacitation. Neutralized, pivot to hostile 2. He'll be in shock. Close distance, control and subdue, total time, 3.4 seconds. The plan was there, perfect and lethal, a muscle memory etched into my soul by a decade of relentless training. My body tensed, the coiled spring ready to explode. But the ghost in my head held me back. Negative, the voice commanded. The mission objective is not immediate neutralization. The objective is total network dismantlement. They have revealed their capability and intent. A physical response now is a tactical error. It compromises the long-term objective. Stand down, observe, collect data. And so I stood. A statue carved from rage and discipline. Thorne, misinterpreting my stillness as fear, as the paralysis of a weak man, finally turned his attention to me. His eyes, cold and empty as a shark's, swept over me with dismissive contempt. He saw a man holding a garden hose. He saw a husband stunned into inaction. He saw exactly what I wanted him to see. He saw a victim. "Your wife," he announced, his voice gliding across the manicured lawn, a serpent in our Eden, "has a temper. A rather costly one, it turns out. You have 48 hours to remove the unapproved flora." He gestured vaguely at Sarah's beautiful, chaotic native plant garden. "Before we bring in a crew to remove it for you. The cost of that removal, plus the fine for this little outburst, will be applied to your account. I suggest you get it under control." He turned, signaling the end of the conversation, ready to glide back into his air-conditioned fortress on wheels, having just successfully concluded another hostile takeover of a family's peace and security. The enforcer, Carl, wasn't finished. He needed one last taste of dominance. He took a half step toward me, a predator testing the fences of its enclosure, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. He thought my silence was his victory. "What's the matter, pal?" "Cat got your tongue." He wanted a reaction. He needed me to yell, to swing, to give him the excuse to put me on the ground next to my wife. It was the fuel his pathetic existence ran on. He took another deliberate, arrogant step. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't shift my weight from the balls of my feet. I just let my eyes, my real eyes, the ones I kept hidden behind a placid suburban facade, lock onto his. I dropped the mask. I let him see the abyss. I let him look past the quiet neighbor and see the ghost behind him. The ancient, lethal calm of a man who has walked through valleys of death and come out the other side with nothing but silence and a precise understanding of human anatomy. Carl, a man who had built his life on a foundation of cheap intimidation and the fear he could generate in weaker men, felt a sudden, inexplicable, and utterly paralyzing wave of genuine primal fear. He stopped dead in his tracks. His smirk evaporated, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. His brain, his body, his very soul screamed at him that moving 1 inch closer would be the final, fatal mistake of his life. He didn't know who I was. He didn't know what I was. But some animal instinct deep inside him, the part that knows the difference between a dog that barks and a wolf that doesn't have to, recognized a superior predator. He had been playing with a house cat, and he had just realized it was a tiger. My voice, when it came, was preternaturally quiet, almost a whisper, yet it seemed to cut through the afternoon air with the chilling finality of a judge's gavel, sentencing a man to death. "You're right," I said, my gaze shifting from the thug to the man who held his leash. Thorne, who had already turned his back, stopped. He turned back slightly, intrigued by the unexpected, almost agreeable response. He was a man who loved to be right. I held his gaze, looking right through his expensive sunglasses, right through his carefully constructed armor of wealth and power. It was necessary. Thorne's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched in confusion. "I'm glad you agree," he began, a condescending smile forming on his lips. "You needed to show me exactly who you are," I interrupted, the words dropping like stones into a deep, dark well, each one perfectly spaced. "You needed to show me your tactics, your personnel, your limits, and your vulnerabilities." I paused, letting the implications of my words sink into the quiet air between us. "And now I'm going to show you who I am." 2 years earlier, Sarah and I stood on this same patch of land, though it felt like a different universe then. We were parked at the end of a long gravel driveway, the engine of our dusty SUV ticking as it cooled. Before us, the house wasn't just a structure of wood and stone. It was a promise. A sprawling, single-story ranch, unassuming but solid, with a wide, welcoming porch and large windows that seemed to drink in the afternoon light. It was nestled on 5 acres of rolling pasture, bordered by a dense, old-growth forest on one side and a wide, placid creek on the other. It was a fortress of tranquility, and for the first time in over a decade, the man I had been allowed the man I wanted to be to breathe. I remember the exact look on Sarah's face. The lines of stress that had taken up permanent residence around her eyes seemed to melt away. She had a deep, soulful connection to the earth, a botanist by trade and a gardener by spirit, and this land spoke to her. "This is it, Alex," she had whispered, her voice full of a hope so pure it was almost painful to witness. "This is where we can finally grow something that lasts." She wasn't just talking about the garden. We bought the house that week. My mission then was simple, yet it was the most difficult I had ever undertaken: decompress. Unlearn 15 years of hyper-vigilance. My body had been conditioned to exist in a state of perpetual readiness, a finely tuned instrument of violence and survival. In this new life, that conditioning was a cage. For the first 6 months, I couldn't sleep for more than 4 hours at a time. I would wake up at 0300, my heart pounding, my body drenched in a cold sweat, the ghost of a mission briefing still echoing in my ears. I couldn't sit in a restaurant without mapping every exit and assessing every person who walked through the door as a potential threat. A car backfiring down the street would have my hand instinctively moving to the small of my back, where my sidearm used to be. Every shadow was a potential ambush point. Every quiet moment was just the pause before the chaos. Sarah was patient. She was my anchor in a world that still felt like a combat zone. She would find me on the porch in the middle of the night, staring out into the darkness, and just sit with me, her presence a silent testament to a peace I no longer believed I deserved. "It's okay to stand down, Alex," she would say. "The war is over." But for men like me, the war is never truly over. It just changes shape. It moves from the deserts of Afghanistan and the jungles of South America to the quiet, dark corners of your own mind. The ghosts of the men you hunted and the men you lost, they follow you home. That man, the one haunted by ghosts, the one I was trying so hard to bury beneath a quiet, suburban life, had been forged in the crucible of the United States Navy. I spent 15 years in the service, the last decade of which was with a unit that doesn't officially exist, a place where the work is silent and the operators are ghosts. The Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DEVGRU. The unit civilians and Hollywood have mythologized as SEAL Team 6. Getting there was a journey through hell. BUD/S was the entry fee, a 6-month exercise in turning men into weapons by pushing them past every conceivable physical and mental limit. Then came SQT SEAL qualification training, where you learned the tradecraft. But even then, you were just a SEAL. To get to DEVGRU, you had to be selected. It was an invitation-only process, a brutal culling of the herd where only the most intelligent, most disciplined, and most lethally efficient operators were chosen. It wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about being the smartest. It was about being able to process 1,000 variables in a split second and make the perfect decision every single time when lives were on the line. Even within that elite world, my specialty was unique. I wasn't the breacher, the guy who kicks in the door. I was the ghost who found the right door to kick. My operational focus was human intelligence, and asymmetric warfare. My job was to insert into hostile, non-permissive environments, alone or with a small reconnaissance team, and dismantle enemy networks from the inside out. I didn't win battles with overwhelming force. I won them with surgical precision. I learned to identify and exploit weaknesses, the financial corruption of a warlord, the psychological fragility of a terrorist cell leader, the structural flaws in an enemy's supply chain. I was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. I knew how to make empires crumble without firing a single shot. When the mission was over, I would disappear, leaving behind nothing but chaos and collapse for our enemies, a perfectly prepared battle space for the follow-on forces. It was a dark, necessary art, and I had been a master of it. But the cost of that mastery was a piece of my soul. I was desperate to grow back in the quiet, fertile soil of this new life with Sarah. In Creekwood Estates, I was no longer a ghost. I was just Alex, the quiet, friendly guy at the end of the road. I kept to myself. My new mission parameters were simple. Keep the lawn mowed, keep the gutters clean, and keep Sarah happy. I was known for my incredible discipline. Up at 0400 every morning for a 5-mile run, a habit too deeply ingrained in my DNA to break, and for being surprisingly knowledgeable about everything from small engine repair to the migratory patterns of local birds. I was predictable. I was boring. I was safe. That was the cover identity I had meticulously constructed for my new life. It was a fragile piece, but it was peace nonetheless. A year into that peace, it was tested. A frantic knock echoed through our house late one Saturday night. It was our neighbor from up the street, a retired accountant named David, his face pale with panic. His teenage son, an aspiring Eagle Scout named Kevin, had gone on a solo hike in the dense state park that bordered our neighborhood and hadn't returned. A sudden, violent thunderstorm had rolled in at dusk, washing out the trails and turning the familiar woods into a treacherous labyrinth. The local sheriff's department had launched a search, but it was a clumsy, half-hearted affair. 2 deputies with flashlights were wandering aimlessly around the main trailhead, their grid search patterns utterly useless in the rugged, rain-soaked terrain. I walked over to David's house. The scene was one of quiet, desperate chaos. David's wife was weeping softly in the kitchen. The 2 deputies were standing over a large, laminated map on the dining room table, pointing at all the wrong places. They were thinking like cops, not like survivors. I didn't offer my opinion. I didn't announce my credentials. I just asked a series of quiet, targeted questions. What was he wearing? David produced a photo. A blue rain jacket. Good. High visibility. What was in his pack? A day pack, water, some snacks, a compass. Does he have a history of any injuries? David's eyes widened slightly. His left ankle. He sprained it badly last year. That was the key. Is he right-handed or left-handed? Right-handed. Another key. An uninjured person will tend to veer in the direction of their dominant hand when disoriented. An injured one will favor their good side. I took a copy of the trail map and a bottle of water. I'll take a look around the northern ridge, I said, a deliberately vague statement. I wasn't going for a look. I was going for a recovery. As I walked out, I heard one of the deputies mutter, "Let the guy play hero. He'll be back in an hour, cold and wet." I moved into the woods, and the transformation was immediate. The suburban husband receded, and the operator took over. My senses, dulled by 2 years of peace, came alive. The forest wasn't a collection of trees. It was a complex environment of concealment and exposure, of obstacles and pathways. I ignored the washed-out trails. Kevin wouldn't be on the trails. He was a smart kid. He'd know they would turn into rivers. The storm had come from the northwest, so he would have instinctively sought shelter from the wind and rain. The runoff would have flooded the lower creek beds, forcing him to higher ground. The southern ridge would be the coldest due to the prevailing wind. His left ankle was weak. He was right-handed. He would have favored his right leg, causing him to move in a slight but consistent southeasterly direction, seeking the densest cover he could find. I moved through the forest with a silence and purpose that would have terrified the searching deputies. I wasn't hiking, I was tracking. My eyes scanned the ground, not for footprints, but for disturbances. A freshly broken twig at an unnatural height, a scuff mark on a moss-covered rock, a patch of mud slightly more compressed than the ground around it. I moved with the patient, relentless economy of a predator. An hour and a half later, I found him. He was huddled under a rocky overhang, just as I had predicted, shivering, his face pale, his left ankle swollen to the size of a grapefruit. I didn't make a big show of it. I applied a simple compression wrap using a strip of fabric from my own shirt. I got him hydrated. And then, I piggybacked him for 2 miles out of the forest, my body moving with a strength and endurance that felt like a memory from another life. When we emerged from the tree line, the scene was one of stunned silence. The deputies stared, their mouths agape. David and his wife cried with relief. When the grateful father, his voice choked with emotion, asked me how on earth I had found him so fast, I just shrugged. "I looked for the easiest path with the most cover," I said, repeating the simple, incomplete truth. "It's where anyone would go if they were hurt and scared." As I walked home, soaked and tired, I felt a deep, unsettling chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Those old skills, the ones I had tried so hard to lock away, had come back so easily. And a part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, had enjoyed the hunt. The ghost was still there. He was just dormant. He was waiting. Now, standing on my porch, my wife's blood staining the gravel of the life we had built, I realized the wait was over. For years, I'd worked to bury that man under a foundation of peace and quiet. I had failed. The outside world, in all its casual brutality, had found us. It had kicked in our door. And as I stared at the disappearing tail lights of Thorne's Navigator, I understood with a chilling, absolute clarity that I was going to have to dig that man up again. Only this time, I wouldn't be burying him when the job was done. The first thing I did was get Sarah inside. I moved with a slow, deliberate calm that felt like a lie, a carefully constructed dam holding back a reservoir of cold, black rage. Every cell in my body, Every fiber of my being screamed for immediate, violent retribution. The ghost in my head had already run the scenarios: neutralization, exfiltration, contingency plans. But the man, the husband, had to take over. I helped her to her feet, my touch gentle, my face a mask of serene concern I did not feel. She was trembling, not from fear, but from a violation so profound it had shaken the very foundations of her world. Our home, our sanctuary, had been breached. I settled her on the living room couch with a bag of frozen peas pressed to her swelling cheek and a glass of water she didn't drink. Her eyes were distant, looking at a place I couldn't see, a place where the world was no longer safe. The trust she had in the quiet order of things was broken, and I knew, with a certainty that settled in my gut like a block of ice, that I was the only one who could put the pieces back together. But I wouldn't do it by being the man she married. I would have to do it by being the man I had promised her I'd left behind. "I'm going to make a few calls," I said softly, my voice a carefully modulated deception. She just nodded, her gaze fixed on the window overlooking her ruined garden. I didn't make any calls. I walked into my home office, a quiet room at the back of the house filled with books on history and engineering, and I closed the door. This was no longer an office. It was a command center. I sat down at my desk, pulled out a clean, leather-bound notebook and a pen, and I began to build the target package on Mr. Thorne and his entire corrupt ecosystem. The mission had begun. To defeat an enemy, you must first understand him. You must map his kingdom, identify his lieutenants, understand the source of his power, and find the cracks in his armor. Thorne's kingdom was the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association, and I was about to conduct a full-scale reconnaissance of his empire of petty tyranny. His power, I quickly discerned from the HOA's own convoluted public documents, was not derived from community consensus, but from brilliantly weaponized bureaucracy. Thorne was a master of the fine print. He had taken a sleepy, benign association and, through a series of expertly manipulated board meetings and ambiguously worded amendments, had transformed it into his own personal enforcement agency. He controlled the three key committees that gave the HOA its teeth: the Architectural Review Committee, the Covenants Committee, and the Fining Committee. And he had stacked each one with his own hand-picked cronies. The ARC, which was supposed to be a panel of residents ensuring aesthetic harmony, was in reality a three-person goon squad. Its chairman was Thorne's personal injury lawyer. The other two members were the wives of his weekend golfing partners. They didn't review submissions based on merit. They reviewed them based on loyalty. If you were in Thorne's good graces, you could paint your house purple. If you weren't, you'd get a violation notice for having a welcome mat that was half an inch too wide. They were the gatekeepers, and the toll was absolute fealty to the king. The Covenants Committee was his intelligence-gathering wing, a network of busybodies and sycophants who were rewarded with preferential treatment for reporting on their neighbors. They were encouraged to submit anonymous complaints, which Thorne would then use to initiate the harassment process. It was a perfect system of control, turning neighbor against neighbor, fostering an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust that prevented any organized opposition from forming. But the true source of his power, the sharp end of the spear, was the Fining Committee. Chaired by Thorne himself, this was the star chamber where guilt was predetermined and appeals were a theatrical formality. He had rewritten the bylaws to grant this committee unilateral authority to levy fines, place liens, and even initiate foreclosure proceedings, all without any meaningful oversight. He had built a system that allowed him to legally steal people's homes, and he had done it all under the guise of maintaining property values. To understand the true nature of his evil, I had to look at his victims. My research led me to public property records, to the ghosts of families he had exorcised from this neighborhood. The most heartbreaking story belonged to the Garzas, Maria and Hector Garza. They had lived in their small, tidy home on Willow Lane for over 30 years. He was a retired high school history teacher. She was a homemaker who grew the most beautiful roses in the entire county. Their story, which I pieced together from county clerk records and archived HOA newsletters, was a slow-motion execution. It started with their roof. After a hailstorm, they'd hired a local, family-owned roofing company, a reputable firm that had been in business for 50 years. Their mistake was not using Prestige Exteriors, the exclusive HOA-approved vendor whose prices were nearly double the market rate. 2 weeks after their new roof was installed, the first notice arrived. It was a cold, impersonal form letter. Violation. Bylaw 17.4. Harmonious color palettes. The shingles they had chosen, a standard shade of charcoal gray, were deemed inconsistent with the approved community aesthetic. The fine was $100. Hector Garza, a man who had spent his life teaching children about the Constitution and due process, wrote a polite, detailed letter of appeal. He included color samples, photographs of a dozen other homes with identical shingles, and a copy of the bylaw, which contained no specific language about shingle color. The fining committee, which was to say Thorne, denied his appeal without comment. A week later, a second notice arrived. The original fine had now been compounded by a $50 per day late fee. The total was now $450. The notices kept coming. Failure to remediate, another $250. Legal review fee, an entirely fabricated charge of $500. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts. The Garzas, living on a fixed pension, couldn't keep up. They tried to organize a petition with their neighbors, but Thorne got wind of it. The few neighbors who had initially agreed to sign suddenly received their own flurry of violation notices for overgrown shrubs and cracked driveway pavers. The message was clear: stay out of it, or you're next. The petition died. Isolated and terrified, the Garzas fell behind. When the fines and fees reached a staggering $15,000, Thorne made his final move. He had the HOA's lawyer, the same man who chaired the Architectural Review Committee, place a lien on their home. They were served with foreclosure papers. 6 months after the first notice about their roof had arrived, Maria and Hector Garza, facing financial ruin and the public humiliation of a foreclosure auction, sold their home of 30 years to a holding company called Creekwood Equity Partners for a fraction of its market value. They walked away with almost nothing and moved into a small apartment in a different town, their spirits broken. That was the end of their story in the public record. But it wasn't the end of my investigation. I spent the next 4 hours digging into Creekwood Equity Partners. It was a ghost, an LLC with a P.O. box for an address. But every ghost leaves a trail. Using a series of proprietary databases I still had access to from my former life, I peeled back the layers of corporate anonymity. The registered agent for the LLC was a law firm. The partner who signed the incorporation documents was a man named Philip Thorne, Thorne's son-in-law. He hadn't just bullied an elderly couple out of their home. He had orchestrated a predatory, fraudulent scheme to steal it for his own family, laundering it through a corporate entity to hide his involvement. This wasn't just an abuse of power. This was organized crime. The network was a tangled web of nepotism and kickbacks. Prestige Exteriors and Prestige Green Landscaping, the HOA's 2 largest vendors, were both shell corporations owned by Thorne's wife, Eleanor. He was using resident dues to pay his own company's inflated rates for substandard work, a clear case of embezzlement. His political cover came from a man named Bob Laren, a city councilman who sat on the zoning board. Lauren was a former business partner of Thorne's from his failed Cypress Point development, and a review of Lauren's voting record showed that he had single-handedly blocked 3 separate municipal investigations into the Creekwood HOA over the past 2 years, citing a lack of credible evidence. Thorne hadn't just corrupted a neighborhood, he had extended his tendrils of influence into the local government. He had built a wall around his kingdom, not just with bylaws, but with political allies who ensured his impunity. With this knowledge, the harassment campaign against Sarah and me snapped into sharp focus. The initial, impersonal notices about the mailbox and the garden hose were probes, simple tests of my compliance. When I met each one with a calm, legal, and logical countermove, Thorne realized I was not like his other victims. I was not easily intimidated. So he escalated. He shifted the attack from the impersonal to the deeply personal. He targeted the one thing I couldn't defend with legal precedent or logical arguments: my wife's passion. The notices about her garden were cruel by design. I pulled them out and laid them on my desk, a paper trail of escalating psychological warfare. The first one was almost laughably vague: violation of aesthetic cohesion. The next was more pointed: introduction of unfeminine and disorderly flora. The final one, which had arrived the day before the assault, was a direct attack on her spirit. Failure to maintain orderly beauty is a reflection of a failure to respect the community. This wasn't about flowers. This was a strategic campaign designed to inflict emotional distress, to find the weak point in our defenses. Thorne couldn't get to me, so he went after her. He was trying to break her spirit, hoping it would break my resolve. The physical assault was the final, brutal exclamation point on that campaign. He had authorized it, I was now certain, as a calculated move to provoke a violent reaction from me. He wanted me to snap. He wanted me to become the monster, the unhinged veteran, so he could use my reaction to destroy me legally and socially. I sat back in my chair, the full, ugly scope of his operation laid out before me. The pieces were all there: the fraud, the embezzlement, the conspiracy, the psychological warfare. He thought he was a king, untouchable in his castle of fine print and fear. He thought he was fighting a stubborn homeowner who was in over his head. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that his calculated provocations hadn't just poked a bear. They had awakened a ghost. He had declared war on the wrong man, and I was about to wage a campaign of asymmetric warfare so total, so precise, that by the time it was over, his entire kingdom would be nothing but a pile of ash. He wanted a war. I was going to give him one. The night after the assault was a descent into a cold, familiar darkness. But this was not the darkness of despair. It was the darkness of the hunt. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, a weakness I wouldn't permit. While Sarah slept fitfully in our bed, the ghost of a whimper occasionally escaping her lips, I sat in the sterile blue glow of my monitors, the war having already begun. My rage, a white-hot supernova that threatened to consume me in the moments after the attack, had been transmuted. I had taken that raw, explosive energy and compressed it, channeling it into the cold, clean lines of a mission plan. It became fuel. It became a focus. My home office was no longer a room. It was the nerve center of a covert operation. My objective was simple: not just to defeat Thorne, but to utterly dismantle his reality, to erase his empire so completely that the world would forget he ever had one. The first phase of any operation is intelligence gathering. You don't fire a shot until you know the enemy's strength, his weaknesses, his patterns, his fears. You build a target package so detailed, so intimate, that you know him better than he knows himself. I began with open-source intelligence, the art of finding diamonds in the digital garbage of the modern world. I wasn't just looking for information, I was hunting for leverage. My first target was the instrument, not the architect. Carl, the thug. Men like Carl are simple creatures, driven by ego and insecurity. Their digital footprints are sloppy. I found his social media profiles in under 5 minutes. They were a pathetic monument to a life of mediocrity and borrowed toughness. Pictures of him flexing in a dirty gym mirror, posts filled with misspelled political rants, and a long, bitter history of complaining about ex-girlfriends. But amidst the noise, I found the signal. I found a public court records database and ran his name. 2 prior assault charges, both from bar fights, both pleaded down to misdemeanors by a cheap public defender. But the original police reports were public record. I downloaded them. They painted a picture of a man with no impulse control, a bully who preyed on those he perceived as weaker. More importantly, they listed his previous addresses and employers. One of those employers was a warehouse logistics company where he had been fired for theft. Another loose thread. The rookie, the lookout, was even easier. His name was Kevin, and his social media was a fire hose of youthful stupidity. He had posted a picture of himself and Carl just last week, leaning against Thorne's Navigator, both of them wearing their Patriot Enforcement Solutions polos. Kevin's caption read, "New gig, keeping the neighborhood safe, # security, # enforcement, # making moves." It was a gift. It was photographic evidence of their employment, time-stamped, geotagged. It was the kind of amateur mistake that gets operations blown, and it told me I was dealing with clowns, not professionals. This wasn't a sophisticated security detail. It was a goon squad. Thorne was a different challenge. His digital life was a fortress, meticulously curated by a team of public relations professionals. His LinkedIn profile was a monument to his civic leadership and business acumen. His name appeared in dozens of puff pieces in local business journals and on the websites of the charities to which he made very public, tax-deductible donations. He was a pillar of the community, a man of wealth and taste. It was a beautiful lie. To find the truth, I had to go back in time. I used the Wayback Machine, a digital archive of the internet, to find older, less sanitized versions of his company's websites. I dug through archived newspaper articles from a decade ago, back when his star was still rising. And there, buried in a 2012 article from the Houston Business Chronicle about his ambitious Cypress Point development project, I found the crack in his armor. The article was celebratory, but it mentioned, in passing, the project's unconventional financing structure, which relied on a consortium of private, out-of-state lenders. Private lenders are not, by themselves, a red flag. But for a project of that scale, it was unusual. It hinted at a man who couldn't secure traditional financing from a reputable bank. It hinted at a man who was a bigger risk than he appeared. It was the scent of desperation, preserved in the digital amber of a forgotten news article. That was the thread I would pull, until his entire world unraveled. With the digital profiles built, I moved to the second phase: signals intelligence and surveillance. I needed to understand their patterns, their rhythms, their habits. I needed to map their world. My own home security system, a series of high-definition cameras I had installed when we moved in, provided the baseline. I spent hours reviewing the footage from the past month, cross-referencing the timestamps with the violation notices we had received. A clear pattern emerged. Their patrols weren't random, they were targeted. They would drive past our house an average of 4 times a day, slowing down each time, their windows always down. They weren't just patrolling, they were observing. They were trying to intimidate. But I needed more than just a view from my own fortress. I needed to see the entire battle space. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, I deployed my own surveillance assets. In a grove of trees on the edge of the state park, a spot that provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the entrance to Creekwood Estates, I installed a small, weatherproof trail camera with a cellular data link. It was motion-activated and had a powerful telephoto lens. Now I would see every vehicle that came and went. My second asset was more audacious. I had kept a few tools from my old life, pieces of gear that were technically civilian legal, but were miles beyond what any normal person would own. One of them was a high-gain parabolic microphone. At 0300, I took a walk along the public creek path that ran behind the neighborhood. I found a spot directly behind the HOA's small brick-and-mortar community clubhouse, where Thorne held his star chamber meetings. I concealed the microphone inside a hollowed-out log, its sensitive dish aimed directly at the clubhouse's rear window. It was a long shot, but if Thorne was foolish enough to discuss his criminal activities within those walls, I would now have a seat at the table. For 2 days, I did nothing but watch and listen. I compiled a detailed pattern-of-life analysis on Carl and Kevin. Their discipline was pathetic. Their patrol started promptly at 900 hours, but by 9:30, they were parked at a local donut shop. They spent nearly 2 hours at the same greasy sandwich joint for lunch every day. Carl took a smoke break every 45 minutes, always in the same spot behind the clubhouse, where he would complain loudly on his phone about his alimony payments. They were lazy, predictable, and utterly unprofessional. They were an occupying force that had grown fat and complacent. The final phase, the one that would provide the kill shot, was financial intelligence. The Cypress Point development was the key. I spent an entire night in the deep web, using encrypted servers and a series of anonymizing relays to access international financial databases, the kind of places where money goes to hide. I was a ghost in the machine, a digital phantom hunting for the sins of a real estate developer. And I found them. The consortium of private lenders was a network of offshore holding companies based in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus, all classic havens for money laundering. Following the trail of wire transfers was like navigating a labyrinth, but it was a skill I had honed while hunting the financiers of global terrorism. I traced the money from the lenders to a series of shell corporations Thorne had set up, and then to the Cypress Point development's primary accounts. And that's where I found the fraud. He had used inflated property appraisals and forged construction invoices to secure far more funding than the project actually cost. He had created millions of dollars in phantom expenses. The excess cash, the dirty money, hadn't just vanished. He had laundered it. And the primary instrument for that laundering was a holding company called Creekwood Equity Partners. My blood ran cold when I saw the name again. It was the same company that had bought the Garza's home. He hadn't just bullied them. He had used their stolen equity as a cog in his money laundering machine. He had folded his local crimes into his larger, federal ones. This was the lever. This was the weapon. This wasn't just a violation of HOA bylaws. This was a potential violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, the law that was created to dismantle the mafia. He was using a legitimate-seeming enterprise, the HOA, to conduct a pattern of criminal activity, including mail fraud for the threatening notices, wire fraud for the financial schemes, and extortion for what he did to the Garzas and was trying to do to us. I sat back in my chair, the first rays of dawn painting the eastern sky. The target package was complete. I had his psychology, his patterns, and his crimes, all neatly compiled in a multi-layered, encrypted file. I had him. He just didn't know it yet. He thought this was a neighborhood dispute, a game of fines and regulations that he could win because he wrote the rules. He couldn't possibly comprehend that he was now the target of a full-spectrum intelligence operation being run by a man who had been trained by the United States government to dismantle regimes. He thought he was a king in his castle. I had just finished mapping every secret passage, every structural weakness, and every escape tunnel. My finger hovered over the mouse. I opened a secure, encrypted communication channel and selected a single contact from a list of ghosts. A man I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. A man who now works as a senior prosecutor in the Department of Justice's Public Integrity section. I attached the file. The subject line was simple. Unconventional target package. High confidence. I wrote a short 2-sentence message. It's Alex. I'm retired, and I'm safe. I think you'll find this interesting. I hit send. The missile was launched. The war had moved from the shadows into the light, and Thorne, in his arrogant, blissful ignorance, had no idea that his world was about to end. He was about to learn the difference between a neighborhood bully and a man who had hunted monsters for a living. For 3 days, the world held its breath. The silence that followed my digital missile launch was not the silence of peace, but the charged, heavy quiet of a cold war. Thorne was wounded, exposed, his carefully constructed reputation smoldering from the internal fires of community outrage and the external pressure of a nascent federal inquiry. A predictable man would have retreated, lawyered up, and tried to manage the fallout. But Thorne was not just a criminal, he was a narcissist, and a cornered narcissist does not retreat. He escalates. He attempts to burn the world that has rejected him. I knew he was coming. It was the only move left on the board for a man like him. The waiting was the hardest part. It was a slow, grinding torment that gnawed at the edges of my discipline. Every rustle of leaves in the forest was a potential footstep. Every passing headlight on the main road was a reconnaissance vehicle. The ghost in my head was on high alert, running endless threat simulations, turning our 5 acres of peace into a complex, 3-dimensional battle space of interlocking fields of fire and fatal funnels. I walked the property line each evening at dusk, not as a homeowner enjoying his land, but as a commander inspecting his defenses. I checked the tension on the silent alarms I had woven into the fence line. I cleaned the lenses on the cellular trail cams. I mapped the shadows as they stretched and shifted with the setting sun. I was preparing. Sarah felt the shift in me, in the very air of the house. I had become quiet, distant. The easy warmth that had slowly returned to our lives had receded, replaced by a still, watchful coldness. I was a sentry on a wall she couldn't see, guarding against a threat she could only feel. We moved around each other like ghosts in our own home, the unspoken tension a third presence in every room. "You're expecting them, aren't you?" she asked one evening, her voice small against the loud chorus of crickets outside. We were in the kitchen. I was cleaning my rifle, an old habit that was more about meditation than preparation. The rhythmic, precise motion of cleaning the bolt, of oiling the steel, was a comfort. I didn't look up from my work. "He's lost control of the narrative and the legal high ground," I said, my voice flat and analytical. "His finances are about to be scrutinized by professionals. He's a predator, and predators, when cornered and wounded, revert to their most basic instinct: violence. He needs to re-establish dominance. He needs to make the problem, me, go away. He'll send his dogs. It's the only move he has left." She wrapped her arms around herself. "And what are you going to do?" I finally looked up, my eyes meeting hers. "I'm going to end it," I said. "Permanently." The coldness in my own voice startled even me. The ghost was no longer just a whisper in my head. He was sitting at the kitchen table with us. The alert came on the third night, just after midnight. It wasn't a high-tech alarm. It was a simple, subtle break in the pattern. My trail cam at the entrance to the neighborhood pinged my phone with a single grainy image. It was a dark, windowless panel van, the kind used by contractors or kidnappers, its license plates caked with mud. It didn't belong. It had turned into the neighborhood, driven half a mile, and then pulled over to the side of the road, its lights off. They weren't coming from the front. They were flanking. They were going to come through the woods. Amateurs. I moved through the house with a silent, fluid grace. I didn't turn on any lights. I went to the main breaker and killed the power to the exterior floodlights, plunging the entire property into a deep, natural darkness. I opened the back door just a crack, enough to eliminate the telltale sound of it opening later. I walked to the living room window, a ghost in my own home, and I watched the tree line. 20 minutes later, I saw them. 2 figures, black shapes detaching themselves from the deeper black of the forest. They moved with clumsy, heavy footsteps, their arrogance making them loud. They were carrying tools, crowbars, a heavy bolt cutter. They thought they were on a simple mission of vandalism and intimidation. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they had just walked into a prepared ambush, meticulously designed by a man who had spent his life turning the enemy's aggression into his own greatest weapon. My yard was no longer a lawn. It was a layered defense system designed to do one thing: shatter their OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. A fighter's ability to function depends on that cycle. If you can break it at the orient phase, if you can destroy their ability to understand what is happening to them, they cannot decide and they cannot act. They become little more than panicked animals. And I was about to introduce them to a world of absolute sensory chaos. As they reached the edge of Sarah's garden, their boots tripped a nearly invisible fishing line I had strung just above the grass. It wasn't a booby trap. It was a trigger. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. A series of high-powered agricultural-grade sprinklers I had replumbed and aimed earlier erupted from the ground. Not with water, but with a pressurized blast of cold, foul-smelling liquid, a mixture of deer repellent and concentrated fish emulsion I had bought at the local feed store. It was a viscous, clinging fluid that soaked them in an instant, the shocking cold and the nauseating stench an immediate, visceral assault on their senses. Simultaneously, the tripwire activated a series of small, hidden speakers I had placed around the yard. There was no music, no warning, just a cacophony of disorienting sound I had engineered on my laptop. It was a layered audio attack. The high-pitched, nerve-shredding whine of dental drills, the panicked screeching of pigs at a slaughterhouse, and a low-frequency bass tone that vibrated at around 19 hertz, the so-called fear frequency, a sound that is felt more than heard, creating a primal, inexplicable sense of dread and anxiety in the human chest. They were soaked in filth, blinded by the sudden spray, and deafened by a soundscape from hell. Their world, which seconds before had been a quiet, dark yard, had become a nightmare. Their OODA loop was shattered. They couldn't observe. They couldn't orient. They stumbled around, yelling in confusion, their flashlights cutting useless beams through the misty spray. They were no longer a team of aggressors. They were 2 isolated, terrified men. That's when I engaged. The first target was the rookie, Kevin. He was the weak link. He had stumbled away from Carl, trying to wipe the stinking liquid from his eyes. I moved through the darkness like a wraith, my footsteps masked by the chaotic noise. I came up behind him, my hand clamping over his mouth, stifling his panicked gasp before it could form. My other arm wrapped around his chest, my bicep constricting against his ribs in a crushing python grip, lifting him off his feet and carrying him backward into the deeper shadows of the large oak tree at the edge of the forest. I didn't hurt him. I controlled him. I deposited him on the ground, my knee pressed firmly into the small of his back, my voice a cold, sibilant whisper directly in his ear. "You made a mistake coming here," I hissed, my breath hot against his skin. "You will be silent. You will stay right here. You will not move until I come back for you. Do you understand me?" He whimpered, a pathetic, terrified sound, and nodded frantically. I released him and melted back into the darkness. Threat neutralized. Time elapsed. 12 seconds. Carl was still in the center of the yard, a raging bull in a china shop. He was spinning in circles, his crowbar held out in front of him, a useless steel wand against an invisible enemy. "Come on out, you coward," he bellowed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and nascent fear. "Show yourself." "I'm right here, Carl," I said, my voice calm and conversational, coming from his left, from the direction of the porch. He spun, swinging the heavy crowbar in a wild, horizontal arc that would have decapitated me had I been there. The metal bar whistled through the empty, misty air. "You missed," I said, my voice now coming from his right, from the direction of the garden. "Your form is sloppy." He was panicking now, his breathing coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He lunged toward the house, a desperate, clumsy charge, thinking he could break a window and use the interior light to his advantage. It was the exact move I had anticipated, the move I had wanted him to make. He was channeling his fear into forward aggression, a predictable and fatal mistake. As his boot hit the first step of the porch, I dropped down from the low-hanging roof of the veranda above him. I had been there the entire time, a silent predator perched just above his head. I didn't land with a crash. I landed with the quiet, controlled precision of a cat, my entire body weight of 200 pounds of dense muscle and bone, driving him face first into the wooden planks of the porch. The impact was brutal. The crowbar flew from his grasp and clattered across the deck. He rolled over, his face a mask of contorted rage and utter disbelief. He was big, and he was strong, and he was fueled by a cocktail of adrenaline and terror. He threw a wild, telegraphed right hook. I didn't block it. I redirected it. I met his wrist with my open palm, guiding the force of his blow harmlessly past my head, using his own momentum to pull him off balance. I didn't strike back. I controlled him. I systematically dismantled his ability to fight, not with brute force, but with the cold, brutal geometry of close-quarters combat. I secured his right arm, my hand gripping his wrist, my other hand cupping his elbow. I applied a simple, inescapable rotating joint lock. He roared in pain as the ligaments in his shoulder stretched to their breaking point. He tried to resist, but it was like trying to fight the tide. I was using his own strength against him, the mechanics of his own body as a weapon. Phase 3. The financial attack. While the community was in revolt, the real attack was happening in the silent, invisible world of high finance and federal law enforcement. My old contact at the Department of Justice, a brilliant and relentless prosecutor named Marcus, had received my target package. He called me on an encrypted line that afternoon. "Alex," he said, his voice a low, appreciative hum, "you told me you were retired. This doesn't look like retirement. This looks like a declaration of war." "He put his hands on my wife, Marcus," I said. "He declared it, not me." There was a long pause. "The file is comprehensive," he said, a significant understatement. "The local stuff, the HOA fraud, the embezzlement, it's a solid state-level case. But the wire fraud charges are the key. That gives us federal jurisdiction. Tell me about the Cypress Point development." I walked him through it, through the web of offshore lenders and shell corporations. He needed a way to clean the dirty money from the fraudulent loans, I explained, and he used the HOA and the equity he stole from residents like the Garzas as part of his laundering cycle. It's a classic RICO predicate, Marcus agreed. But these offshore accounts are a labyrinth. It could take us a year to get the warrants and subpoenas to untangle this. There's more, I said. I found something last night. A final piece. It's the linchpin. I directed him to the last file in the package. A file I had only uncovered in the final hours of my deep dive. It was a single, heavily encrypted transaction record I had pulled from a server in Eastern Europe. It had taken all of my old skills to find it and decrypt it. I heard the sound of him typing, then a sharp intake of breath. Jesus, Alex, are you seeing this? On the screen was a detailed record of a SWIFT transfer. It was a wire of $250,000 sent from Creekwood Equity Partners, Thorne's primary money laundering vehicle, to a numbered account at a private bank. But it was the location of the bank that made it a federal crime of the highest order. The bank wasn't in the Cayman Islands or Switzerland. The transaction, dated March 12, 2025, had been routed through a holding company based in Karachi, Pakistan. That's not just a money laundering haven, Alex, Marcus said, his voice now devoid of its earlier warmth, replaced by the cold, hard edge of a federal prosecutor who smelled blood. That holding company has known ties to terrorist financing networks. Your HOA tyrant isn't just a local crook. He just crossed the line into a national security threat. By sending that money, Thorne had not just committed wire fraud. He had potentially violated the Patriot Act. He had turned his petty suburban criminal enterprise into a matter of international importance. He thought he was a king. In reality, he was a minnow who had just swum into a shark tank. This changes everything, Marcus said. I'm no longer just interested. I'm taking this to the top. I can get a FISA warrant on this. We can move fast. Very fast. Stay put. And Alex, stay retired. Let us handle it from here. I hung up. Thorne's fate was now sealed. He thought he was fighting a disgruntled homeowner. He had no idea he was now the target of a full-spectrum federal investigation that had started with a punch in a quiet suburb and now stretched all the way to the shadowy world of terror finance in Karachi. Phase 4. Total isolation and collapse. The federal hammer fell with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking to behold. On Monday morning, simultaneous raids were executed. It wasn't local cops. It was teams of FBI agents in tactical gear, supported by forensic accountants from the IRS. They didn't just raid Thorne's office. They hit his home, his lawyer's office, and the home of his son-in-law, Philip, all at the same time. It was a coordinated, multi-location takedown, executed with the kind of precision that only comes when you have a perfect blueprint of the enemy's network. My target package had been that blueprint. Thorne was rendered powerless. His assets were frozen. His computers were seized. His records were confiscated. He was a king trapped in a crumbling castle with no army and no treasury. His last line of defense, his political cover, Councilman Bob Laren, saw the federal writing on the wall. That same afternoon, Laren held a press conference, his face a mask of feigned shock and outrage, in which he called Thorne a cancer on our community and pledged his full cooperation with the federal investigation. He had cut Thorne loose, saving his own skin. Thorne was now completely and utterly alone. He was a pariah in his own neighborhood, his name a curse on the lips of the residents he had once terrorized. His enforcers had abandoned him. His political allies had betrayed him. And the full, terrifying weight of the United States federal government was now pressing down on him. I watched it all from the quiet sanctuary of my home. I watched the news reports. I read the breathless articles. Sarah sat with me, her hand resting quietly on mine. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a slow, dawning understanding. She was finally seeing the ghost. not as a monster, but as a protector, a dark, necessary force that I had kept chained in the basement of my soul for her, for us. Thorne was broken. His power was gone. His world had been dismantled piece by piece, exactly as I had planned. The final act was not about punishment. It was about erasure. It was about ensuring that he could never again use his wealth and his influence to harm another innocent family. The war was over. All that was left was the sentencing. The end, when it came, was not a thunderous explosion, but the quiet, inexorable closing of a steel trap. For a week, Thorne was a ghost in his own life, a man besieged from all sides. His name was a stain in the local press. His friends in the community no longer returned his calls. His bank accounts were frozen, his power stripped away, his world shrinking with each passing hour. I watched him from a distance, a digital phantom tracking his every move. I saw the late-night visits from his lawyers, the frantic, panicked energy that radiated even through the grainy thermal feed of my trail cam. He was trapped, and he knew it. A man like Thorne, a man whose entire identity was built on a foundation of dominance and control, does not surrender. He flees. The final move of the game came on a Thursday night, just before midnight. My trail cam at the neighborhood entrance pinged. It wasn't Thorne's black Navigator, it was his wife's silver Mercedes, a vehicle he never drove, slipping out of the subdivision like a thief in the night. An amateur's attempt at misdirection. He was running. I zoomed in on the image, a single figure in the driver's seat, a man's silhouette. I ran the license plate through a public database. It confirmed the vehicle belonged to Eleanor Thorne. He thought he was being clever. He was being predictable. I didn't call the local police. I made one last encrypted call to Marcus at the DOJ. "He's on the move," I said, my voice calm. "Silver Mercedes, wife's registration." "He's not heading for the main international airport. That's too obvious. There's a smaller executive airfield an hour north. Private charters. He'll have a plane waiting. He thinks he can disappear." "He's not wrong to think it," Marcus replied, his voice a low hum of controlled energy. "A man with his resources can buy a new identity in a dozen different countries. But he made one mistake. He got your attention." There was a pause, the sound of keyboard clicks in the background. "We've had a federal air marshal team on standby at that airfield for the last 48 hours, just on a hunch. Your hunch. I'll make the call. Nice work, Alex. We'll take it from here." Thorne's final act was not one of defiance, but of pathetic, desperate escape. His public humiliation, however, was still to come. The federal agents didn't arrest him at the dark, lonely airfield. That would have been too merciful. They tracked him. They let him believe he was getting away. The next morning, armed with the information from Thorne's seized calendars and the cooperation of his terrified son-in-law, they found him where he felt most powerful, most untouchable, the grand dining room of the Oakmont Country Club. It was his inner sanctum, a place of hushed tones, of clinking silverware against fine china, of the quiet, confident murmur of old money and corrupt power. He was seated at his usual table, surrounded by his wealthy associates, the bankers, the developers, the politicians who had been the pillars of his corrupt world. He was trying to project an aura of calm, of a man weathering a temporary storm, a minor inconvenience. He was laughing, a brittle, forced sound, as he lifted a glass of expensive champagne to his lips. That's when they entered. Not local cops, 4 men in dark, impeccably tailored suits. They moved through the room with a silent, coordinated purpose that immediately silenced the idle chatter. They were FBI. They didn't rush, they didn't shout. They simply walked to his table and stood there, 4 silent angels of legal retribution. "Mr. Thorne," the lead agent said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the entire United States federal government. You're under arrest." Thorne's face, so carefully composed, shattered. The color drained from his skin, leaving a pasty, gray mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the suddenly silent room. His friends, the men who had profited from his corruption, didn't move to help him. They looked away. They studied their napkins. They suddenly became fascinated by the pattern on the wallpaper. In that moment, Thorne was utterly, completely alone. He had been socially executed. They let him out in handcuffs, his head bowed, the king of Creekwood Estates, now a common criminal, paraded through the very hall that had once been the symbol of his power. The image of his perp walk, captured by a news helicopter hovering outside, became the defining photograph of the scandal. It was the picture of a tyrant who had been dethroned, a bully who had finally met a force he couldn't intimidate. The legal annihilation that followed was a formality, a slow, grinding process of total erasure. The federal indictment was a work of art, a 50-page document detailing his entire criminal enterprise. The charges were overwhelming: multiple counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and the charge that sealed his fate, violating the Patriot Act by routing funds through the terror financing network in Karachi. The last detail, when it was unsealed, sent a shockwave through the national news. Thorne wasn't just a local crook. He was a disgrace who had, in his greed, inadvertently brushed up against the enemies of the state. Facing a lifetime in prison, and with every one of his former associates, from his lawyer to Councilman Lauren to his own son-in-law, lining up to testify against him, he took a plea deal. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had clearly seen enough of men like Thorne, sentenced him to 10 years in a federal penitentiary, with no possibility of parole. But his punishment wasn't just about time, it was about erasure. As part of the deal, he agreed to a complete asset forfeiture. Everything, his houses, his cars, his art collection, his offshore accounts, was seized by the federal government. His wealth, the source of his power and his identity, was wiped from the face of the earth. He would leave prison a broken old man. His kingdom was dismantled with the same clinical precision. A federal judge signed a court order officially and permanently dissolving the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association, declaring it a predatory criminal enterprise from its inception. A court-appointed receiver was tasked with liquidating all of its assets and establishing a restitution fund. The primary beneficiaries were Thorne's victims. The Garzas, their faces a mixture of disbelief and tearful joy, were the first to receive a check. It was enough to buy back their old home, which the government had seized from Thorne's son-in-law. 2 months later, I watched from my porch as a moving truck pulled up to their house on Willow Lane. I saw Maria Garza, her hands trembling, walk into her old garden and gently touch the petals of a single resilient rose that had survived the neglect. It was a small, quiet moment of profound justice. Dozens of other families received full restitution for every fraudulent fine, every illegal fee. The community, purged of the cancer that had been killing it from within, began to heal. The oppressive weight of Thorne's rule was gone. People started talking to each other again, not as suspicious adversaries, but as neighbors. They planted gardens filled with unfeminine wildflowers. They painted their front doors whatever color they damn well pleased. They tore up Thorne's Book of Covenants and formed a voluntary neighborhood watch, a true community built on mutual respect, not fear. My war was over. The ghost in my head, the operator I had been forced to resurrect, had completed his mission. He had identified the threat, dismantled the network, and neutralized the target. Now he could finally, truly, stand down. The silence he left behind was not an absence of noise. It was the presence of peace. The final scene of the entire ordeal was not one of victory or vengeance, but one of simple, profound restoration. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, a few months later. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming jasmine. Sarah and I were in her garden, on our knees in the rich, dark soil, planting a new bed of sunflowers where the thugs had tried to leave a scar. The physical and emotional chasm that had opened between us in the heat of the battle was gone, filled in by a quiet, resilient understanding. She looked at me, her hands covered in dirt, a smudge of soil on her cheek. The memory of the assault was still there, a faint shadow behind her eyes, but it no longer held any power over her. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. She was a gardener, tending to her sacred ground. She smiled, a real, genuine smile, the first one I had seen that seemed to reach all the way to her soul. I handed her a small trowel, its wooden handle worn smooth from use. "I think," I said, my voice soft, the words carrying the weight of our entire journey, "we finally have the peace we were looking for." She took my hand, her grip firm and steady, her fingers interlaced with mine. She looked from my face to the vibrant, thriving garden around us, a testament to her unbreakable spirit. "No," she said, her eyes shining with a strength that humbled me. "We didn't find it, Alex. We fought for it. We built it." And in that moment I knew she was right. Peace wasn't a place you could retreat to. It was a structure you had to build, a garden you had to tend, a line you had to defend. I was no longer the man who froze, nor the man who fought. I was simply her husband again, a gardener in his own sanctuary, a man finally at peace in his own skin. The ghost wasn't gone. He never would be. But he was no longer haunting. He was a guardian, a silent sentry on the wall of the life we had built together, ensuring that no one would ever breach it again. The mission was finally, truly, complete. He managed to break free, a testament to his raw animal strength, and scrambled to his feet. He was a former army grunt, I remembered from my research, not a paper pusher, and he had some residual training. He dropped into a recognizable, if clumsy, fighting stance. He was trying to re-engage, to turn this back into a fight he thought he could win. It was the last mistake he would ever make. He lunged. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing charge. I didn't retreat. I moved into him. I sidestepped his charge, my body brushing past his, and as he went by, I applied a textbook brachial stun, a precise, open-handed strike to the side of the neck, targeting the carotid artery and the vagus nerve. It's not a knockout blow. It's a system reboot. It temporarily disrupts blood flow to the brain, causing an instantaneous, non-lethal neurological shutdown. His eyes rolled back in his head, the aggression draining from his face, replaced by a slack, empty confusion. He collapsed onto the lawn in a heap, not unconscious, but momentarily paralyzed, his body rebooting like a crashed computer. I walked over to the rookie, who was still huddled in the shadows, paralyzed with a fear far more effective than any physical restraint. I pulled him roughly to his feet. Then I retrieved the crowbar. I pressed its cold, heavy steel into his trembling hands. "Your friend is having a moment," I said, my voice a low, dangerous calm. "He needs to rest. You will put him in your van. You will leave this property. You will then leave this state. You will forget Mr. Thorne's name. You will forget this address. If I ever see either of you again, if I ever hear of you working for Thorne again in any capacity, I will find you." I leaned in close, my voice dropping to a near-silent whisper, a promise of biblical finality. "And the next lesson will be permanent." He finally looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified recognition. He wasn't just looking at a homeowner. He was looking at something else, something he had only seen in training videos or heard about in hushed, fearful stories. He recognized the economy of motion, the clinical efficiency, the absolute absence of rage in the application of overwhelming violence. "What the hell are you?" he gasped, the words tumbling out in a choked whisper. I leaned in even closer, my face inches from his, the ghost finally showing its face. "I'm the guy who spent a decade hunting men 10 times more dangerous than you for a living," I whispered. "And now, I'm retired. I came here for peace." I straightened up, the full weight of my presence pressing down on him. "And I will have my peace." I didn't need to say anything else. I stood there, a silent statue in the darkness, and I watched as the terrified rookie managed to half-drag, half-carry Carl's disoriented, stumbling bulk back to the van. He didn't even bother to close the doors properly before peeling out of my driveway, leaving a trail of rubber, shame, and the nauseating stench of fish emulsion behind him. The physical threat was neutralized. The dogs had been put back on their leash, and then the leashes had been cut. But the real enemy, the man who had sent them, was still sitting on his throne, believing himself to be safe. Now it was time to topple the king. The adrenaline of the fight evaporated into the cold night air, leaving behind not a victor's satisfaction, but the chilling, metallic taste of purpose. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel relief. I felt the quiet, profound focus of a man who had just completed one objective and was already moving on to the next. The physical threat was neutralized, a messy but necessary prelude to the real war. Now it was time to wage a campaign of annihilation. Against Thorne's entire organization, a campaign fought not with fists and fury, but with the cold, silent weapons of information, fear, and the law. I moved with the methodical precision of a crime scene investigator. I retrieved the rookie's dropped crowbar, its steel still cold from the night air. Using a rag from my workshop, I carefully wiped it clean of his prints, then my own, and placed it in an evidence bag. I walked the perimeter of the fight, my eyes scanning the disturbed earth, collecting the small, almost invisible pieces of the encounter. A button that had popped off Carl's shirt, a few drops of his blood on a stone by the porch, the muddy tire tracks left by the fleeing van. Each item was photographed, catalogued, and sealed. This wasn't for the local police. This was for my own file, a meticulous record of their escalation and my response. This was ammunition. When I re-entered the house, the silence was a physical weight. Sarah was sitting in the dark living room, a single lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She wasn't looking at me, but at the window, at the yard where the violence had just unfolded. The gulf between us was no longer just emotional. It felt geographical, an impassable chasm that had opened up in our own home. She saw what I had done, the terrifying efficiency with which I had dispatched 2 grown men. She had not seen a protector defending his home. She had seen a predator reclaiming his territory. The ghost was out, and he terrified her. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper that threatened to break. "The fighting is over," I said, choosing my words with surgical care. "The war has just begun." I didn't try to explain further. She wouldn't understand. Not yet. I walked past her and back into my office, the command center, and closed the door. The time for physical action was past. It was now time for a campaign of psychological and legal warfare so total, so devastating, that Thorne would not just be defeated. He would be erased. Phase 1. The Fear Campaign. My first move was to sever the head of the snake from its body. Thorne's power was built on the loyalty, or rather the fear, of his underlings. I needed to shatter that foundation. I took out a clean, untraceable burner phone I kept for emergencies. I composed a simple 2-sentence text message. It was anonymous, sent from a spoofed number that would appear to originate from a cell tower in a different state. I sent it to the personal cell phone number I had found for Thorne during my initial intelligence gathering. The message read, "Your dogs are off the leash. They talk. You're next." I imagined him waking up to that message, his heart lurching in his chest. His 2 enforcers, his instruments of physical intimidation, were gone. They weren't answering their phones. They had vanished into the night. And now, this, a message from a ghost. It was designed to do one thing: plant a seed of deep, gnawing paranoia in his mind. Were Carl and Kevin talking to the police? Had they flipped? Who sent this? The message offered no answers, only a threat. It would turn his own thoughts against him, making him see shadows in every corner, betrayal in every face. A man consumed by fear cannot think strategically. He can only react. And I wanted him to react, making mistakes, while I moved on to the next phase. Phase 2. The community schism. Thorne's second pillar of power was his control over the community narrative. He used the HOA's official channels, the newsletter, the Facebook group, as his personal propaganda machine, broadcasting his version of reality and silencing all dissent. It was time to burn that machine to the ground. At precisely 8 a.m. the next morning, as residents were drinking their morning coffee and scrolling through their phones, the anonymous email landed in their inboxes. The audio file of Thorne ordering Carl to make sure the wife gets the message was the primary weapon. But it wasn't just the audio. The email was a masterpiece of strategic information warfare. It included a link to a hastily built anonymous website. On that website, I posted everything. The full, unedited security footage of the initial assault on Sarah, showing the unprovoked nature of the attack. High-resolution photographs of her bruised face. A link to the public records of Carl's prior assault charges. A scanned copy of the fraudulent lien that had been used to steal the Garza's home. And a detailed, easy-to-understand breakdown of the HOA's finances, showing the money trail that led from their dues directly to the shell corporation owned by Thorne's wife. The effect was like dropping a lit match into a munitions factory. The Creekwood Estates Facebook group, once a sleepy forum for posting pictures of lost cats and complaining about garbage collection, erupted into a digital firestorm. Thorne's carefully crafted image as a benevolent protector of property values was incinerated in a matter of minutes. People were posting the audio file, the link to the website, their own long suppressed stories of Thorne's bullying and financial malfeasance. He tried to fight back, deleting posts, banning members, but for every post he deleted, 10 more appeared. He had lost control. The digital mob, armed with the truth, was tearing him apart. He was a king watching his own subjects storm the castle, and his walls were made of paper.